Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la charla junto al Dr. Charles Limb. Charles Limb es el jefe de otología y neurotología y de cirugía de la base del cráneo en la Universidad de California en San Francisco. Además, él es miembro de la facultad del Conservatorio de Música en Peabody. Charles Limb combina sus dos pasiones para estudiar la forma en que el cerebro crea y percibe la música. Es especialista en audición y cirujano en el Hospital Johns Hopkins, que realiza implantes cocleares con pacientes que han perdido la audición. Charles Limb además toca el saxofón, el piano y el bajo. Nosotros conocimos a Charles Limb en sus conversaciones en TED y pensamos que era esencial tenerlo dentro del Festival Academia Internacional de Música Portillo. Los dejo entonces con la conversación junto al Dr. Charles Limb.
So welcome, Charles, to our festival. This is our third year, and we're so looking forward to this new way of connecting. And we are using this time to connect not only with musicians, but also with different areas that we find are essential also for musicians. So thank you for being here, Charles, and we're so looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person.
Thank you. Charles, I have been watching some of your lectures, and I'm so fascinated about the word creativity. Could you tell us what that word means to you?
Sure. Yeah. Sometimes I think it means everything. You know, when I think about how it's possible that human beings are, as a species, able to be where they are today, when you look at all of the accomplishments of the world, if you look at all of the historical cultures and different things that we've achieved, they're all a product of human creativity. And so I think of it as a very substantive topic. I don't view it as entertainment. I don't view it as art alone. I view it really as one of the highest expressions of the human capacity to innovate and to generate new ideas. And so to me, it's a very loaded, important topic to understand. And it's all the more notable that scientists understand relatively little about how the creative brain functions. For me, you know, when I think about music, one of the things that always drew me to jazz was this idea of the sound of surprise, that you could hear something new, something unexpected. And in that moment of surprise, when it hits you and you hear it, you really understand that you were alive to experience a moment of newness, of creation, where something did not exist before, and then all of a sudden it existed and made your life better. And so as a lover of music, as a musician, and as a scientist, I've been trying to understand those things.
So Charles, one of the things that I think a kind of fundamental key thing that is missing in our world is this understanding that we are creators, not followers nor conformers, but we do. That that our whole education system is set up to condition children to a particular way of almost non-thinking, just conforming and following, rather than setting them up to understand the creative power of their own mind, their own spirit. And so what you're talking about, I think, is fantastic, and especially when we're talking to these students in the festival about being the creative force of their own lives. So you're a surgeon, you're a researcher that brings together science and music, you're a musician, and you're a lover of life. And I asked you before we came online, where do you find the time for all of this? But what does creativity give you that sort of allows you to do so much? And I'm sure you do many more things than that.
Thank you. You said a lot of things there that I think I'd like to comment on. Maybe when it comes to education is where it starts to reveal how, in some ways, we've failed. I think to recognize the central importance of the creative mind. And I say that because when school budgets are threatened, when school curriculums are being restructured, it's often with this feeling that the arts are elective, that somehow you could cut back that part of the day and the student would be fine. And to me, that just reflects a general, I think, underappreciation or short-sightedness about what it means to develop a creative mind, or to fail to understand the future significance of having a society that's not creative. I think that if you imagine developing a world of people that could only regurgitate what they've been told, but never come up with a new idea, you could see right away the problems there, because the problems that we're going to be faced with tomorrow, they don't exist today yet. We haven't identified, in the same way that 100 years ago people wouldn't understand the problems of the internet. We have to, I think, really capitalize on the flexibility of the human mind. And so it's my hope that through this kind of science, we start to see creativity not as an option, but as an essential need for us to exist. And then we can look at art, we can look at music properly in that context. Because to some extent, I feel that the artists, they're the creative experts. They're the ones who have really devoted their entire lives to developing this facility that they have, the skill they have to generate something new, to generate something beautiful. And yes, it can be entertaining. Yes, it can be enjoyable. It can be all of these things. But beyond that, I think it reflects something much deeper than something that's just entertaining or enjoyable. I think it would be similar to thinking that somehow you could boil down food to whether something tastes good or not. I mean, I think there's certainly a lot more to it than that. Now, as opposed to when it comes to time, I think to me, time is life is always like a race against the clock, isn't it, for all of us? And so at a very early age, I started to feel, or almost fear, this passing of time. And I still have this feeling every minute, almost this feeling like, there's another minute gone, another minute gone. And, I think this when I have meals, and I think this when I listen to music. And so music is the kind of thing that you cannot freeze. It can only be experienced with the passage of time. It's not static the way a picture or a photograph or a painting is, where you can just kind of capture the image indefinitely. Music has to be listened to in time. And so every time you listen to something, you're passing through time. Likewise, that means that every time you make a decision to listen to something, you're making a decision not to listen to all these other things. And I think about the fact that I have a finite number of hours to listen to music in my life, in addition of hours to live. But I think that there's a finite number of things that I will get to hear in my life. And every time I'm deciding to listen to something, I realize to myself, this is something else that I'm not going to hear. And so when I start looking at the vast streaming libraries that exist on things like, Spotify and Tidal, you feel a little overwhelmed. And I'm grateful that I can kind of access it, but I'm also sad because I realize I'm only ever going to hear a fraction of the music that was ever created. That feeling about time, though, I think has led me to not want to waste my own time, but also to think that I must pursue lines of thinking and lines of work that I find personally meaningful to me. As a physician and as a scientist, I didn't want to spend my time doing work that I didn't find really deeply engaging. And so the kinds of questions you would ask if you were on a desert island somewhere, I wanted to have that feeling about my work, that no matter what the circumstances were, no matter whether or not anybody else cared, that these are the things I would be thinking about. And so that's why I started studying music with my time, because I felt that it was really one of the few things that I really deeply cared about. And many years later, here I am, and I'm still asking the same questions, but I get to have conversations now with people like you who actually have an interest in what I've come up with. So it's been terrific.
Thank you, Charles. I'm a violinist. I'm a conductor as well. And my father was a jazz musician. He was a bass player. And for me, it was always fascinating to hear him improvise, which is something that I still owe to myself. Not to that one day I said I had to start doing this. But for me, like when I have tried it, it feels like it uses a different part of my mind, no? When I was a student at the University of Michigan as a violinist, and I took a improvisation class, a freestyle class. That was amazing for me, no? But in the moment that the teacher start using chords, I didn't feel free enough anymore, no? So I'm very curious from your perspective, if there is any, maybe there's no difference on how a classical musician works in comparison to a jazz musician in terms of his or her brain.
Absolutely. No, thank you for the question. And it's a very, I think, complex topic and a lot of different layers to it. And I think that it's hard to disentangle certain things about environment and upbringing and genetics and talent and people's interest level. But I think there is something very fundamentally different about the act of improvisation in the brain versus the act of playing something that's predestined or predetermined for you in a musical score. And so I think the classical jazz divide reflects that dichotomy extremely well, in the sense that most classical musicians, as a product of their upbringing, their training, and maybe their interest, they really spend the bulk of their careers trying to perfectly execute something that is laid out for them. In fact, how they're judged is generally, at least today, now it was different, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, I think classical music was quite different, where the improvised cadenza was a real thing that often reflected one's true self musically, so to speak. But today, even the cadenzas are often pre-written out, and improvisation is largely a lost art in classical music. There are several musicians that can do this. Gabriela Montero comes to mind because she's just so amazing. But the reason why they are notable is because it's so rare in the classical world to see this. Now, you can imagine that somebody's brain who's developed in that framework, where the bulk of your practicing efforts and skills are really about how you execute, in a way, how you follow the rules. And then you apply that, or you try to transfer that over to what it means to a jazz musician to approach music, where actually rules barely exist, right? There's guidelines, there's musical theory, there's your ear, there's how something sounds. But you can't take a formula and predict what's going to happen in jazz, because the rules for that haven't really, in fact, the rule is to not do something that's been done before and to express what's true to yourself. But how does one become an improviser? So yes, they have to have an upbringing that way. They have to have an interest in it. And maybe they have to have a certain level of talent, but they have to actually practice it. You don't just suddenly, you're not just born a jazz musician, or maybe you are and you forget it. You get it taught out of you. But when most jazz musicians get there through a long series of years where they're practicing. But what are they practicing? They're not practicing how to follow a score to a perfect degree. What they're practicing is how to use the tools of musical theory in a very functional way. You mentioned chords, and it's interesting that you find that chords kind of start to throw you off. For me, as a jazz player and somebody who studies other brilliant jazz musicians, I love chords, because it's like the ingredients by which you cook a dish. It's like handing you beautiful, perfect ingredients and saying, now go make something that tastes delicious. Because the chords that's the foundation, the theoretical foundation upon which a jazz improvisation is based. And so a jazz musician is taking this knowledge in a very fluid way that is not predetermined in terms of usage. And the better they are, the more automatically they can recall the particular musical element or theory for their needs. And so somebody who's practicing that way their whole life, where they're constantly every day trying to just not follow something, will have a very different view of what it means to play music. And what we have found in the science to this is that it's funny that you described you said you don't have that part of your brain. Maybe actually what you don't have is the ability to turn off the part of your brain that is thinking that you don't have that part of the brain. Because it seems that creativity in jazz, in terms of brain function, is actually largely linked in experts to the ability to suppress parts of your brain that deal with conscious self-monitoring and effortful planning. In a way, you're turning off the part of your brain that's monitoring your output, that is making you self-conscious, so that you can have a more novel, free flow of ideas. And in a classical hierarchy where, it's always about being judged, whether you're right or wrong, in jazz, there's really no right or wrong. There's no proper or correct solution. There's an infinite number of possible solutions to the puzzle. And so I think that that's one way to think about the difference between a classical musician and a jazz musician.
That is really wow. And I'm not a musician, I have a fantastic friend here who was on track to be one of the great, rock band drummers of the world, and then took a sort of angled path into meditation and sort of yogic practices beyond, and he left that. And after sort of 20 years of refining his brain mind self, doing his own experiment, he came back to drumming, but more as a percussionist, and from a totally different place, from this creative place. And he's worked a lot with James Morrison, the great Australian trumpeter, and I've been to concerts that he's curated where he brings together like 15 of his friends, these great jazz musicians, and he leads off with something, but they basically meditate together first. So they tune themselves on another way, in a frequency way, and they've all got their own practices of whatever it is, but they tune in and then they just take off. And the journey is, as part of the audience, is just extraordinary. And that, for many people who don't have any of those practices, that would just be total paralyzing, fear-provoking things, which is what you were saying, Ali. But how then is it useful for classical musicians who are listening to this, who are going, yeah, but I'll never be a jazz musician, so it doesn't matter? How would improvising and this practice of opening up the creative brain mind, how would that be useful for them in their life, in their career?
No, that's a great question. And I think that there are probably different answers for different people on what the kind of pragmatic implications of something like improvisation training are. But let me try to address it a little bit more broadly. I think that when it comes to music and art, there's always value in developing your neural networks, because to some extent, your ability to play your instrument is a product of how well your brain functions. And one version of playing may have to be how well you're executing what's on paper, the sort of concrete nature of that. But there's a whole other aspect of it, most people would call it musicianship, that has to do with the things that are not really on the paper. And those are the areas of musicianship that don't really follow the rules, because there's not really a clear guideline of what one must do in those circumstances. I believe that when we judge a classical musician's creativity, what are we really talking about? We're really talking about the individual things that they're doing, really the deviations or the additions to what's printed on the paper that makes the performance kind of uniquely theirs. Where we say, oh, you know what? That was, that interpretation was very unique. And so what we're saying is that they did something creative in that moment. And maybe the statistical distribution of what's creative in classical music is just much closer in terms of it reflecting the score than in something like jazz, but there's still deviations. And so part of what happens, I think, when you develop that part of your brain is that you're getting comfortable with the idea of injecting uncertainty, unpredictability, unplanned creativity into something that is pre-planned and rehearsed. And that may be when a musician starts to feel the most free, because I think there's a certain freedom, whether it's philosophical or actual, because your brain is actually less constrained. There's a certain freedom to not having to follow a rule set. And maybe the difference between a masterpiece performance and a really good performance is the degree to which those intangible things that are not on the paper really come to life and come together. And so I believe that one of the ways to practice that, and you can see this, there's some classical musicians that are often fighting against this kind of rigidity, that there's a certain rigidity to the way they're playing or maybe the way they're thinking. And I think jazz is really a good way, or improvisation is a really good way to go against that and to actually to suspend. In fact, it's very liberating to many musicians when they first try this and they're like, oh, I can't make a mistake. And it's true, there's no mistakes because you play what you want to play. Who am I to tell you that a C sharp was the wrong note to play there, right? I mean, if you wanted to play a C sharp, you play a C sharp. And so that, I think, gives you a certain confidence that your individuality matters and that you can inject that into your playing. And so if I were a classical musician, and especially if I started to feel like I'm reaching the limits of my technical ability to play, then I would start thinking about developing in a way the non-technical parts of my ability to play, the things that have to do more with who I am as a musician and as a person.
Thank you, Charles. One of the reasons that we created this festival is to concentrate on chamber music repertoire, specifically string quartets and woodwind quintets. And now that I'm listening to you, I get even more excited about the idea of the festival, because the idea of playing chamber music is actually to have a conversation, to communicate with others. And in order to communicate, you have to go past the technique, no? Eventually, no? So what? And then somehow, and I'm curious to ask you this: when we speak now, like even now that we're having this conversation, we don't plan every word that we talk, no, that we speak. So somehow we in our everyday life, we do improvise actually, right? So it is in us, but so I guess we had to make sure that we do it also in the moment that we perform, and that when we communicate with other musicians, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So let me be clear. I do not think that improvisation is just limited to music at all. You know, it's certainly conversation is maybe the most common example of this, what we call generative capacity of the human brain. Our brains are designed this way. They have to be, so that we can actually live. If we could only react in a predictable way, we would have been extinguished as a species a long time ago. We would have come across something that we didn't have a pre-planned algorithm for, and we'd be dead. And so I think the fact is that we can react to things as they're happening and come up with new solutions. It's the same thing that happens when you're driving your car on a highway. You're navigating, you're problem solving your way home. You don't know exactly how you're going to get home. You know the job you're going to take, but you don't know all the maneuvers that you're going to have to take to get yourself home. It just happens. And these are not things that anybody would view as art. Most people don't view conversations as art, but the neural processes that are taking place there are very similar to what happens in some versions of spontaneous art that are linked to these kind of flow states. And most humans, even non-musicians, I think will be very familiar with the idea of a flow state. Most people have something that gives it to them where they get deeply immersed. The passage of time changes. There's a sense of automaticity, ease, happiness usually, but you're sort of in the zone. I think athletes often describe this. Surgeons have it. I feel this way when I'm in the middle of surgery. Actually doing surgery feels very similar to playing an instrument, surprisingly. But this is, I think, a part of how the brain engages with subject matter. It gets deeper and deeper, and as you focus, the rest of the world dissolves away, and it's part of how I think your brain gets better at doing something.
Charles, there's an English theatre director, and I've forgotten his name, but he initiated I don't know if you've ever seen Theatre Sports, which is a public kind of theatre games thing. And it's not so much popular now, but it was really popular when I was studying and acting. And it was so you'd have teams and it would be improvisational games. Anyway, he invented this thing in the theatre. And in his book, one of the things that he said is that you have to listen in order to be changed. And I think this is a kind of underpinning notion of life, really. That life is about discovery. It is about, kind of growing and flourishing and to be changed. But if we hark back again, a lot of, and especially in classical music, it is about following rules and kind of containing you and driving you down a particular track. So the resistance to even listening to anything, and I think we see that in politics, we see it everywhere today. People don't listen to something that's outside their track. They don't, and they certainly don't listen in order to be changed. But this is something that certainly jazz music, like, is a living metaphor for this way of living, which is generative and creative and brings such beauty into existence. So I don't know, that's not a question, but
No, but interestingly that you mentioned theater improvisation. So, there are many art forms that have their own version of improvisation. It's not just music, and I think comedic improvisation, theater improvisation, is one of the immediate things that comes to mind. And so, in some of our studies, and we've looked at rap musicians, we've looked at caricature artists, but we've recently done a study of comedic improvisation of individuals that are really born out of the theater world. There's a very famous comedy institution in Chicago called the Second City. And so I've been collaborating with people from Second City and through a group here in San Francisco called Speechless, where we essentially are bringing comedians to the brain scanner to look at what happens in their brain when they are improvising. And this is verbal improvisation, not musical. And I believe that what we will see when all is said and done, we're sort of coming up with we're heading towards a model of a neural model of creativity. I think we will see that regardless of the genre or particular form or medium or area in which you practice, there's going to be a shared universal substrate in the brain that is the kind of the key network where creative thought is originating. And then there's going to be differences that are going to be linked to the specific art form. So if it's athletics, it's going to be very much a motor-driven kind of thing. If it's a visual thing, if it's a painting kind of thing, you may have more visual cortex, and music has more auditory cortex and so forth. But I believe that we will see that the more different kinds of creativity we study, that there is a certain universal substrate, which is why we can be creative in many different avenues. It's why we can have this conversation and then also play music. I think it's this sort of same part of our brain that's being utilized in this kind of new context. And so I hope to learn a lot from other art forms and certainly not just musicians to try to understand what's actually happening in this creative brain. I think this is why I start off by saying it's a very complex topic. I don't view this as a superficial thing. I think that the other, illusion or fallacy I want to make sure I address is that scientists are just starting. I mean, music has been around forever. It's been around since the beginning of human history. And scientists are really just starting to understand this. And so it's going to take more than a few scientists and a few studies to unravel these mysteries. These are the questions of a lifetime, right? I don't expect that by the end of my lifetime, these questions will have been answered. In fact, I think if anything, what I hope to have accomplished is to help contribute to the idea of asking the right question, so that the scientists that come after me can also start adding to the knowledge. And by the time, many years have gone by, we can say, oh, look what we know now that we used to not understand about the human brain. And so, no, I think there's a lot to it. And I could see why somebody who participates in that kind of a program, this idea of listening, starts to hear the world in a different way. I think what happens is you get an openness when you realize that the only way you can come up with something genuine and novel is if you really listen to what happened before, which is the case in jazz, which is the case in comedic improvisation. The percentage of the brain, the percentage of neuronal activity that you're dedicating towards listening is just going up. You're really you're diverting all resources to those parts of your brain to process the sound, to make sure you get it, so that you can increase your reaction time and your recall and your flexibility. I think that that's key, not just to improvisation, but it's key to being, I think, a decent human being in this world, where that if we could hear one another better, we would be better people to one another. And so I really believe that there's an openness to the world that happens when you are training yourself to listen better, because you realize it's not about you. It's actually about everything else. And so I hope that that's one of the byproducts of what happens in the science of this. For me personally, it's why I've always turned to music, right? It's always been the greatest teacher for me, because it is how I learn about everything else in the world and how everyone else experiences the same universal things that I experience and that you experience. You know, we all have pain, we all have love, grief, sadness, joy, all of these feelings that are, to me, they're like perfectly rendered through music, because it's your way to see how somebody else lived it and to understand that you're not alone in feeling that. And so I have always turned to music as a way to try to understand this world that we're living in, and maybe to understand the people that are in it.
Wow.
Thank you, Charles. Wonderful.
Yeah.
I have a question, and I'm curious. Sometimes students, classical musicians, could practice a passage for maybe half an hour. And at the end of the half an hour, it sounds wonderful. Then next day, they play the same passage and it's not there. Why do you think that happens? Why?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you. So, you know, we certainly don't know. We certainly don't know everything about how the brain stabilizes information that it is acquiring. Now, some things are put into short-term memory. And so we've all experienced this with information. You have to remember this phone number for the next 10 seconds, okay? And you do it, right? But it's gone the next day. There's no way, you know, if I give you $1 million, you're not recalling that phone number, even though you could do it. And so somewhere in our brain is the capacity to put, you know, we have a little buffer of short-term memory mechanisms where you place things that you need for immediate retrieval, and then you dispense with it. And then there's another form that is much more deeply embedded, where you'll never forget it for the rest of your life. And we all have this, where you can think about this moment. Yes, that happened to me in 8th grade. That day it was cloudy out, and I remember what I was wearing and what it smelled like. And the certain moments were seared into your brain. And sometimes it's because it's paired with something that was traumatic or joyous or meaningful, but in some way it had relevance. And so I think what happens in music practice is some degree of ratio of short-term versus long-term learning, and it's not always under your control. And this is why I think the longer you practice, the more expert you are, the more you're embedding things in long-term memory as opposed to just in short-term retrieval. There's also this kind of concept of muscle memory, which I think is worth discussing, because the muscles of your fingers don't have little brains in them that have memories. Okay, it's like if your fingers were not attached to your brain, your fingers wouldn't have memories. And so what is muscle memory? It's really neural mental coordination. So in order for you to control your fingers a certain way, your brain has to develop the subroutines to do that. And it's learning. It's like, oh, there's this sequence, and then there's that sequence. I've never put my hand in those positions. What happens is physical changes in your hands that improve your ability to do those things. So you get more flexible, you get stronger, you get used to not feeling uncomfortable in contorted positions. And so those fixed physical changes are real. So those are the things that change when an artist is, you know, practicing a lot. There's a physical byproduct of that that makes it easier to do the next version of that movement. But it doesn't happen overnight, right? And so I think what has to happen is that, again, you do the short-term training so that eventually some of it is going into long-term storage banks. And I think one of the holy grails is to figure out how to speed up that process and how to get it so that we could just take a little, you know, it's like people that have a photographic memory, right? You know, we don't have the we don't yet have a way to convert someone into having a photographic memory. They have it or they don't. I mean, it is a real thing. Some people have amazing retrieval mechanisms. And you could imagine that if you could figure out how to do that in music and make everybody's practicing far more efficient, where in 1 hour of practice you get a month's worth of actual benefit in your brain, yeah, I mean, it would just be phenomenal. But this is why I think understanding the neurobiology of things like creativity and musical learning is so important, because actually maybe the arts hold the tool for how scientists can start to understand how to unravel these really powerful concepts of what neurobiology might mean 100 years from now.
Charles, Ali, I'm going to ask you, do you have more musical questions, because this is a musical festival, because I'm going to have a philosophical question with you. But I need to defer if you've got something that you want to, because we just have a few minutes left. And I think, I need to honor the fact that we're sitting in an academic music festival. So Ali, if you've got more questions for Charles from the kind of education point of view with the students?
Actually, Caroline, I think with all this information is plenty. I mean, to launch the festival with such an incredible conversation, especially for me, it's very interesting for me, the idea of practicing well and efficiently, and as you said, no, all this issue with memory, muscular memory, but also memory, like memorizing. I guess that's another topic too, no? Because sometimes, so many times, we are taught that we have to memorize something, no? And which I believe you have to sometimes, because then you can concentrate in other things. But I think there's also a process that you miss there when you do something in a mechanical way, no? So the little specialties that we can talk, and Charles, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit too.
Sure, yeah, and I think now we're getting into the realm of what separates the sort of genius musician from the very good student. And to me, a part of the reason why something like memorizing a piece of music would be valuable is actually so that you can forget it momentarily, that there was a score involved, that you know the music so well that it's no longer a printed page for you. It's actually it's sort of an intact whole that it's in your head. I think all of us have our favorite pieces of music that if you just stop for a moment and you say, okay, let me hear this in my head, you can do it. Your brain will start playing this perfect rendition of this piece of music that you've loved your whole life without there being any actual sound in the room. That's rather than seeing the score of that music, because you're seeing it as an intact auditory object. And in that scenario, I think that's a deeply embedded neural subject now, right? So that auditory object is deeply ingrained in your, when you can do that level of music retrieval, it's because you know it inside and out. It doesn't take any effort to do that. That is what I think the masters have done when they are playing. They have internalized the piece. It's now a part of them. And they turn on the tape recorder in their head. It's right there. And then they're playing it with a certain freedom and ease and command that I think is different than when you view it as a visual sort of roadmap that you're trying to follow and remember. I think that's a very different level. And so while I think that in a way the memorizing of it, because it's stressful, so I think that the problem is the performance aspect of it. Every time you link the performative aspect of especially classical music to evaluating how good something is or talented somebody is, it becomes, I think, problematic, because that added stress of that situation, I think, can sometimes bring down performance. It can also enhance performance depending on the situation, because it ramps you up. But there are certainly people, classical musicians, whose careers have been ruined because they were always being judged, and that the fear of the judgment was greater than the joy they were receiving from the playing. And so I think it's something that we have to think about in how we train young musicians. A lot of students that love music get it trained or taught out of them because they hate the way they're being taught music. And because it's always about evaluation, were you right, were you wrong, did you do it well? There's no equivalent of just like running out on the playground and just playing, like in music, in the way we like, a child likes to play basketball, or soccer or football, whatever. You just give them a ball and they go out and play. You don't think, well, did you do 10 dribbling drills? Did you shoot 100 free throws? Like, you're just not that didactic or structural about it. You just sort of say, okay, they played. But in music, for some reason, there's this sense that you have to have gotten better in a very kind of formal way in order for it to have been a valid practice session. I think it's a problem because we're losing kids, like, music's being lost to a lot of kids because of that, I think, paradigm that we tend to follow. And so hopefully we will start to understand that maybe there are less intimidating ways to teach music and also to evaluate how good somebody is musically.
Yeah, Charles, we're up to our closing time pretty much, but as you speak about that, I'm remembering in our festival last year, it was quite intense. It was after Chile had gone through and was still in the middle of this social uprising where, millions of people were protesting and tear gas. I mean, it was very intense. And then we went up into the mountains with a lot of the students who had been part of these protests. And last year we had a lot of people suffering from altitude sickness and certain levels of anxiety, and they, and then the pressure of the program that they were, and in the evening, after about, I think, the fourth night, there was a young trumpeter came up and a percussionist, this woman, and they started to create sort of jam sessions. And the classical musician, with all of their music from across the whole region, as well as some Occidental music, but the atmosphere that was created of joy. I mean, it was like take the lid off, and the percussionist was playing a box, and everybody was just, those who had the whatever, the creative spirit, just jumped in, and it was unbelievably joyful and bonding, and really, and I think we've been talking in a way about creativity in its utilitarian, pragmatic sense, but to make life worth living, in a sense, creative, like you said, it makes, if we listen, if we hear, which is the creative process, we're better human beings. It's a better life. So can we finish with hearing your thoughts around how creativity gifts us something for life beyond
Absolutely.
our practice?
Well, first of all, let me say I wish I had experienced that moment with you. It sounds like it must have been tremendous. First and foremost, I am somebody who loves music. And although I study music and I try to help people that can't hear music, that's not more important to me than loving the music. And so the reason why I love the music is because, to me, it's the glue. It's the glue that holds all of us together. And it is so good at allowing us to communicate emotions from person to person and make you just so clearly realize that we all are far more similar than we are different to one another. That's why I think it's the glue. And so it's my belief and my hope that music will always be the sort of central reason, in a way, why people gather, because we can understand it and we hear it. It just takes one note. Sometimes you say, I know exactly what you meant when you played that note or when you sang that note. And when I hear that, I think to myself, what could be better in life than surrounding myself with that kind of sound?
Wonderful, Charles.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank
Carolina,
you both for
yeah.
having me here. I really appreciate it. Again, I wish I could join you in person. Maybe one year I'll get to join the festival in person and hear it for myself.
We will be delighted if you could come and join us and also play around with the students and
yeah, lighten up.
I look forward to it, and thank you again for your interest in my work and just spending your time with me. And I hope you're all staying safe in these troubling days.
The same for you over in North America. Yeah.
yeah, thank you, Charles, for being with us here in the festival. For us, and for me personally, I'm just so grateful that you say yes to us, and because we believe that, as you said, that music is a common territory for human beings, and we strongly believe in this, and also we strongly believe that the festival is a holistic festival where we all learn from each other, and I'm just extremely thankful that you joined us today.
Well, thank you so much. It's my pleasure, and it's great to spend some time with you. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.